other embarrassing position, please show me your face for a moment so I can see you. And you can undo your face and go back to putting on your makeup or whatever. Okay.
My makeup is on.
Oh, good. I saw a few faces. Okay. A few people I know. I see my friend Andrea. Who else do I know? Okay. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Agyanatiam Gyanaganata Chakrulumitam Ye Tajmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Well, thank you for reading the verse. In this verse here, which is another way of explaining Gita 4:7, we're talking about Krishna appearing. Now, look at the big context of what we're talking about. The whole rest of this chapter preceding this is a theme that's seen in other places in the Bhagavatam, but I don't believe at any place it's seen quite like it's seen in this chapter. And that is, can somebody tell me what precedes this verse? What's being discussed in this chapter? Can somebody recall from other classes? And you can unmute and tell me. There's
the lineages leading up to Krishna.
Yeah, the lineages. It discusses extensively the lineages, list of names. Now, other words, Prabhupada says all we are is list of names. And we just end up being lists of names. And a few generations from now, no one will know even who our names are. It's just forgotten. Can any of you name your great-great-great-great-grandfather? Maybe one or two know it, done a family tree, but there are lists of names, they're gone. Their bodies are in some cemetery somewheres. You know, I know maybe where my grandparents' graves are, great-grandparents, probably someplace in Europe or whatever. Long lost, just list of names that don't mean anything to me anymore. And so here we have lists of names. Why are these names given? Why so many lists of names? This person begot that person begot this, and this person married so-and-so, and they had 5 sons, and their sons had this daughter, and their daughter had this son, and it goes on and on. Long lists of names. Why would we have such an extensive list of names? Every verse of the Bhagavatam is enough to free us, but how do these verses free us? Anybody know? Anybody have any guesses why this chapter is like this? Maybe Vasudeva made a mistake. I mean, why would it be like this? Sometimes we have just lists. There was a time in the 50s, and Senator McCarthy was this horrible creature in the Senate. And he used to go and ran the House Un-American Activities, not in the Senate, I think in the House or the Senate, it was a Senate. And he ran the Committee on Un-American Activities. And he would read from the floor of the chamber names of people who he thought were communists. And when a member of the Congress is in Congress speaking, they can't be sued for libel. They passed a law to protect themselves. And one day he read a list of names and he dropped the list on the floor by mistake, and somebody picked it up later. And the list was simply a laundry list of his laundry. And he was just saying the names off the top of his head. There was no list. He was just whoever he wanted to accuse, he would accuse, and simply in the mood of grumya gata, idle talk, ruin these people's lives. If they were a communist or not, it made no difference. So sometimes they're just lists and lists. And do they mean anything? Are these lists of names like Senator McCarthy's laundry list? So I've often wondered this myself when I was first reading the Canto. Why such extensive lists of names? Well, there's probably many reasons for it, and there's probably no right or wrong reason we'd come up with, but I'll tell you how I see it. We are working up to the 10th canto. The Bhagavatam is Krishna's body, and the 10th canto is his face. And we actually, in this chapter, a few verses later, talk about Krishna's face. We're actually getting to see God face to face. In order to establish credentials, we establish a family tree. In other words, Krishna is a person, the supreme person, but he appeared in a particular place at a particular time with a particular mission. And the mission is described herein very simply to reestablish religious principles. And when he appeared to do that, we want a real Krishna, not a mythological Krishna. And in order to, I know one devotee scholar is thinking of writing a book now. He told me, a professor, very, very good devotee, and he's thinking of writing a book, Who is Krishna? Establishing the historicity of Krishna. Because many stories come up and fools deride me when I appear in my human form, Krishna says. So by giving lists of names that we can relate to from other scriptures, names that sometimes we can even relate to in history, by giving lists of names, it establishes a pedigree that we are talking about a person who really appeared. It's not just some magician. Sometimes you see a magic show, and when there's a magic show, somebody will appear out of nowheres and then disappear again, by some trickery. So this is not like that. Krishna is actually coming in a lineage. There are people, some we can relate to, some famous kings, some not so famous. It's giving his history that at a certain point in time, he actually did really appear. And it's establishing this is real. This is not some made up mythology. So that's part of the reason that these long lists of names are there. At least that's my realization on it. I'm sure there are other realizations that may be equally or even more engaging. Any questions so far on what I've said? Okay, going on now. Whenever principles of religion deteriorate and irreligion increases, the Supreme Personality appears by his own will. Now, why by his own will? What does that mean? His own will is referring to he doesn't have to come. Prabhupada describes in a purport a few verses later that Krishna is appearing out of compassion. he's comparing because it's just like being a parent. You can't, at some point in time, Prabhupada says, when your kids reach 16, you shake their hands and become their friend. And I've discovered this a little bit the hard way. You can't tell your kids what to do anymore. So you just shake hands and become their friend. And if they go some wayward route, you're always there for them. But you have to let them learn their own lessons. So Krishna is like that. He's letting us learn our lessons, experience our karma. Yet he's always there for us out of compassion and love, just like our parents are there for us. We're there for our children, and good parents are always there for their children. So Krishna then appears by his own will, not that he has to. Sure, there were prayers for him to come. We know Advaita Acharya prayed for Lord Chaitanya to come. The demigods prayed for Krishna to come. The Mahabharata is talking about this. Nevertheless, he's coming by his own will. Now, why does he come? Well, he comes to establish religion. Now, in the Gita, Krishna says to Arjuna, this is very, very important. He says, the science is lost, and I've come to give it to you again. Many times I see folks reading the Mahabharata, and they say, this is what Vedic times were like. This is the way people spoke. It doesn't ever really talk about how they dressed, but this is how things were organized. This is our goal. But Krishna says, in these so-called Vedic times, the science was lost. It was all messed up. Now I've come to reestablish the essence, and the essence is Sarva Dharman Parishaja, surrender unto me. So when we try to read the Mahabharata and understand what Vedic times are, it's not a very successful effort. It can't be very successful because Krishna says the science had been lost. So sure, we can extract some principles of our ashram and how to behave and moral principles. There's a lot to extract, but as far as the culture and lifestyle, Krishna himself says it was a lost science at that time. So why does Krishna come? So he comes to establish certain principles, and the ultimate principle is our connection with Krishna. But in order to get connected with Krishna, what do you first have to do? Well, in the second chapter of the Gita, Krishna goes into this in quite a bit of detail. Deos minyata dehe. He establishes that we're not this body. Now, those of you who have been attending classes have heard many, many times, we're not this body. But what does it mean you're not this body? Personally, I have to remind myself every day I'm not this body. I got an infected toe, and I didn't think I was this body. During that time, I thought I was this toe. Was it hurt? And we relate to it. We find that sometimes children are born and hydrocephalus, it's called. They have a tiny brain, so small it's only a brain stem. Now we know that cognitive functions occur in this part of the brain, and the back of the head. Optical functions occur, and hearing functions occur on the side of the brain. And these children have none of these parts of the brain, just the brain stem is the very beginning of the brain. And these children grow up and they talk and they walk. They're generally not the brightest around, but they're functional. How can they be functional? They don't have a brain. Later on in life, somebody gets a stroke and they lose the same pieces of the brain which this child was missing. And they're totally dysfunctional. They can't see, they can't talk. They basically become practically a vegetable. So one person has this little piece of brain and they're functional. Another person has most of the brain destroyed and they're not functional. How can we explain this? Well, there is one explanation, and the explanation goes like this. That child has a mind that's not material, that hadn't yet identified with the brain. Therefore, a mind is transmitting through the brain. The brain is like the radio, and the mind is like the person speaking into the radio. So it's the transmitter. It's the connection between the subtle body and the gross body. And since that connection wasn't there, the mind made use of what it had, and it went on perfectly well. Not perfectly well, but very well. When somebody has a stroke, they've already so identified with their brain. That mind is so identified that when that piece of the brain is cut off, it's very difficult for the mind to find another place in the brain to transmit its thoughts. And it kind of shuts down and can even become a vegetable. So we can see by studying the science of neurology, we can see how the mind gets attached to the brain. In a similar way, we get attached to all the different parts of our body. Now, at the Bhaktivedanta Institute, which somehow or other I ended up the director of, we study this. And just 2 weeks ago, we had our first in-person seminar since COVID times. We had about 8 or 10 people in person at our new BI headquarters in Gainesville, and we had 4 people attending from around the world by Zoom. And what was our discussion? We were discussing the difference between the mind and the brain. The mind may be material, but it's subtle material. So the first step in going beyond the bodily concept could be to look at subtle material, to understand that the neurons firing is not who we are. And so many neuroscientists, and now they have a new field, neurotheology, discussing the religion, what happens to the brain during religious experiences. And there's this idea that the mind is non-material is becoming so commonplace now. I mean, there's still the gross materialists fight it, but they're fighting what appears to be a losing battle. So what did we discuss at the BI? We discussed experimental ways to understand the mind is different than the brain. How could we study this? Placebo effect, phantom limbs, remote viewing. We looked at all of these phenomena, and we've had a working group working for 1 year now, meeting every week or two. Then we met in person, and the working group continues to establish what experimental methods can we do to demonstrate to those who are materially inclined that their subtle body is different than the gross body. Because once that is established, then we are on that path to going to higher and higher understandings. First, I'm not this body. There's an I in here. Then we can explore the big questions. Who is this I? Who is experiencing this? For example, I'm looking at my screen now, and I see some red on the screen. Now, what is red? If we examine the amount of data coming into my eyeball, it's just some photons are coming in, it's igniting the optic nerve and sending a signal. That signal is not particularly red, it's a signal, it's electrons but I can see the qualia, the essence, that there's redness in there. And the actual, just like if you sometimes you can see these pictures that are very incomplete, but you fill in the blanks and make a complete picture out of it. Sometimes these are optical illusions even. You look at something and somebody sees an old lady and somebody sees a vase. And when you're looking at this, your brain fills in the number of, the amount of information that the eyes send to the brain is well known in neuroscience, isn't enough to give a picture. It's not enough. Your iPhone camera has many, many more pixels than your brain is receiving from your eye. Now that's a curiosity, but the brain and the mind fill it in. And then they come to a conclusion that there's something called redness there or greenness. And there is something behind that. So we're trying to understand who is it that's witnessing what's behind it. None of you are sitting here saying, well, my neuron just fired, and that means I understand what Brahma Tirtha is saying. No, there's somebody listening. The neurons firing then is transmitting a little bit of information, which somebody is integrating into this great picture. The artificial intelligence folks say, always do this calculation. And the calculation says we have X neurons in our head. We know that. Though you have more neurons in your gut than you do your head, when we say gut feeling, there is really truth to that saying, because there are more neurons in your gut than in your head. And you take some little creatures like paramecium who have no neurons, but they go to food, they eat, they mate, they do all kinds of things, and they don't even have any neurons. So neurons is not who we are. Nevertheless, we get attached to our neurons. I gave the example of a baby born with hardly any brain and somebody who has a stroke. One's not attached yet, so they're able to function. Once we get attached, we're kind of stuck. And part of our practice of chanting Hare Krishna and our sadhana is to get us unstuck from this. And that's an experience that is open to anybody. It's very democratic. So the artificial intelligence people do this calculation. We have X billion neurons. And when we build a computer with X billion transistors, we will then be able to transmit our consciousness to the computer and will live forever. This is the makings of some amazing science fiction. And it's a very common science fiction. You just have to go to the bookstore and you'll find a dozen books, science fiction books on that theme, how we can transmit our consciousness to a computer. Now, a few years ago, the artificial intelligence people were in for a rude awakening. And that rude awakening, when we had a conference at the BI 2 years ago called Conscious in Science. And our keynote speaker is Stuart Hamroff, the most prominent leader in the field of studying consciousness, an anesthesiologist, runs the largest conference on consciousness in the world. And he came as our keynote speaker. Very nice fellow who happens to love devotees. Not very, probably an agnostic at the best himself, but he just loves devotees from some historical association. And so I was able to get him to come. Normally, somebody like Stuart, I'd have to give a $5,000 or $10,000 honorarium to get him to come. I gave him $500 and he was more than satisfied, and a ticket, even a coach ticket at that. So he just likes devotees. So Stuart, first, and the artificial intelligence people can't stand him, because what has he done? He's studied the neurons and found out that each neuron itself has microtubulars that are also firing. So each neuron itself is 1,000 times more complex. And so if the artificial intelligence people thought there was a billion, all we need is a billion transistors, by his calculation, you need a trillion transistors. And so if they were only a decade away from having a computer big enough to do a brain, now they're 100 years away. So they don't like him. But we disagree with Stuart, because no matter how many transistors you have, it still is not going to give the experience of I-ness, of who am I? Who's the I who's observing this? In other words, we're computer operators, we're not computers. There's always an operator of a computer. There's a witness to the computer. So Stuart put the artificial intelligence people into great anxiety. And then we, though we appreciate Stuart and like him as a person, we put him in a little anxiety too, because where he's going doesn't take us to the I-ness aspect of it. So what do we do when we realize, okay, you BI nerds, and we're just a bunch of nerds. In fact, our newsletter, anybody would like our newsletter, you can go to our website. I'll put it in the chat. It is in the chat. Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies, bihstudies.org, and sign up for our newsletter. In our newsletter, one of our most popular columns is, of course, Ask a Nerd, because that's who we are. We, when somebody joins the Bhaktivedanta Institute, for those of you who are a little older, you'll appreciate this, they get the pocket protector, which used to be a sign of who was a nerd. They'd have pocket protectors with a bunch of pens in it. I went to an engineering school, and it is the God's honest truth. We had pocket protectors. That's not a joke, because we were nerds. So our BI nerds, what do? We're trying to establish that the body is different than the soul using Sankhya philosophy, general philosophical principles, and scientific experiments. And when we combine all this together, we get a picture that we cannot be this body. And we're trying to demonstrate it. We're not trying to convince the hardcore atheists to give up their atheism. Yamaraj has a way to do that that's much more effective than ours. We can't succeed at that. But we are going to convince the innocent who are influenced by the atheistic point of view that there's another way to look at it that's equally or more scientific, that philosophically makes sense. And if we make sense to you, try it. You can experience it yourself and start realizing you're not this body. Now, my own experience that way. If I'm 50 some odd years of chanting, I occasionally get glimpses, even me, that, yeah, I'm not this body. I think I am. I identify with it, but I can't possibly really be this body. When I was a young boy, I watched a mystery, and this mystery haunted me as a young teenager. Most other kids my age would be playing ball. And their big mystery was, how do I get better at baseball, basketball, football, soccer ball, or some kind of ball? Due to being born with a vision deficiency, playing ball was not an option, impossible. So I couldn't participate in the normal activities. Then something happened. It must have been a remnant from last life. My neighbor's grandfather died. Now, I hardly knew the grandfather. I saw him in passing, but he died. And then my other neighbor's grandfather died. And I went into a tailspin. And my own grandmother was getting close to death. And realization hit me. Wait, these people are dying, but no one can really die. You can go try it yourself. I'm dead. All you can do is imagine being in sleep or anesthesia. You can't imagine not existing. Only thing you can imagine is at this moment, my existence is become dull, but you can't imagine not existing at all. And in my own mind, I couldn't imagine not existing. So therefore, no one could die, but everyone's dying. And it was a huge mystery that I didn't get any answers to until I read the Gita and met Prabhupada. Then it started becoming clear. So it haunted me as a child. It's not the normal way somebody usually grows up, but it was my fate to experience that. But I didn't know, and no one would tell me that I'm not this body. So it was a bewildering set of circumstances. No one could die. I am this body. The bodies are dying. What's going on? That is the essence. The Bhagavatam begins with the aphorism, now is a time to inquire. Who are we really? So what are the ways of our inquiry? Well, through the Bhaktivedanta Institute, we do science and philosophy. Other ways are inquiring are the jnana methods, just philosophical insight. Sometimes we inquire by karma yoga, just doing good things elevates our consciousness and makes things clearer. And ultimately, if we just take up the Hare Krishna movement, as Prabhupada says in the purport here, and associate with Krishna, we get these same realizations. So no matter who you are or what your particular circumstances, you're a philosopher, you're not a philosopher. You like doing good for others. You think everyone's a jerk and don't want to do good for others. I mean, no matter what orientation you come from, there is in the Gita a method for you to understand that you're not this body and to understand you're not this brain. Some by science, some by philosophy, some by good work, some by meditation, some by just jumping to the best, chanting the holy name. So in this 9th canto, we're working up to the point. We've gone through 9 cantos. We've heard all kinds of philosophy, and we've heard all kinds of different angles and different stories. And we worked up to the point by the 9th canto, if we studied it sincerely, we have an inkling that we're not this body. There is a supreme person, and we have some relationship with him, and we're ready to discuss who he is. And then we get to the 10th canto where we see Krishna's face. That's why it's recommended one not jump to the 10th canto. Now, some would say, well, the Krishna book jumps there, but Prabhupada incorporated all 9 cantos into the Krishna book the way he wrote it. So you can actually jump ahead of the line. But if you're just studying the Bhagavatam, we go through all 9 cantos, and by this time we're ready. Now, the 9th canto, as I discussed in a prior class, is a tough canto for a lot of people, because when you've done the 8 cantos, you're kind of in good consciousness, and then you're ready for the 9th canto, which there's a lot of smashing in here. A lot of people do a lot of crazy things, and some ladies get very upset that some of the verses in here talk about this dark side of women. And is this a misogynistic volume, but I assure you, Krishna in the ninth, or Sukadeva Goswami and Vedavyasa in the ninth canto are, as I've said before, equal opportunity smashers. Because you've never seen dumber men in your life than doing things. So it smashes women, it smashes men, smashes us all, so we become a little humble. And by the ninth canto, we've gone through 8. We're ready for a little smashing that, hey, I don't want to be like this. I don't want to be some jerk that goes to his son and says, I haven't enjoyed enough sex. Will you give me your youth? Or does things like this. I mean, we get all kinds of people in here doing odd things. Why is that? It's just Krishna finally just getting us to the point where we're ready to open our hearts for the 10th canto. So that's what's going on here. I'm setting the stage, and the rest of the chapter, this chapter ends in a most beautiful way, as you'll see soon, in which we actually start discussing the beauty of Krishna's face and in detail for the first time in the Bhagavatam. We're getting ready to go face to face with Krishna. That's a big deal. So with that, I'll stop here, see if there are any questions, comments, criticisms, or whatever else anybody wants to say. Somebody can put in the chat or unmute if anybody has any comments or questions.
Hare Krishna, Brahma Tirtha Prabhu, beautiful class, thank you. What's your institution's stance on evolution? Does evolution exist? And I like how you explain how now is the time to ask questions. Am I gonna die? What am I here for? What is this all about? And then I remember asking myself this question when I was probably a child for the first time, when I had just realized that my parents aren't gonna save me from death. I'm just as mortal as everybody else. There's all these ants and insects that I see and smash on the street. So, but then as I grew older, I I was thinking, okay, look at the whale. The whale is a mammal, but why the heck is it underwater? Or a dolphin, for example? Does that mean that this creature evolved somehow? And if evolution is real, am I a product of evolution? Five fingers, just like the monkeys. And this kind of silly questions, they overshadow this essential question. What is this body for? What is the spirit? What's the nature of my I-ness? So here's my silly question. Is evolution real? Please give me your perspective.
Yeah, this is something that I'm a geologist. So in 1977, at the first international conference on Life Comes from Life, I was invited to speak in Vrindavan. And right a month before Prabhupada left us. And my talk was on issues of evolution. So I'm not claiming to be the most expert there is on these things, but I know something about the subject. In fact, Judah Karma was just here. He and Sadaputa wrote that book, Forbidden Archaeology. And I love Judah Karma. So when he's around, the discussions are never dull. And let me see, I have something that, here it is. We'll share this with you in a moment. And the the first answer I give you is the wise guy answer. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of mysteries we just don't know. Certain evolution does occur. I mean, wolves turn into chihuahuas. I mean, we know that. You know, coronavirus turns into Omicron. So some obviously things change. And the question is, and this is what Prabhupada's point was, what makes it change? Where does the information come from? Now, if you take an amoeba, very simple little one cell creature that when you go to India, if you drink the wrong water, you know how nasty an amoeba can be. And you take you and I. Now, if we go from amoeba to us, there's a lot more complexity to us. The amoeba has no neurons. We have 1 billion neurons. So where does the information come to create us? So what's missing in evolution is consciousness. And we see sometimes a tadpole turns into a frog, a caterpillar turns into a butterfly. And so there's a will there, there's a desire. So what's missing in evolutionary theory is the will and desire, the consciousness. So the missing link is not some fossil creature. The missing link is how does consciousness fit into it? Mm-hmm. And at the BI, we're looking at how consciousness drives these things. Mm-hmm. That said, there are many discrepancies. For example, Judah Karma has worked on, we had this theory that 400,000 years ago, some man got embarrassed and decided to put on some clothes for the first time. And nowadays it's reversing, they're taking off their clothes, but that's a whole other thing. So they decided to put on their clothes for the first time and, all this. And then he finds all kinds of evidence of humans being much greater in antiquity, but due to a knowledge filter, these evidences are thrown out. If it doesn't fit, it's not accepted. And he points that out in his book. He's coming out with a new volume of additional evidences. So maybe humans were around a lot longer. Nevertheless, but there were dinosaurs and other. I mean, all of you probably are in New York, have been to the Museum of Natural History, and we see dinosaurs and all of these things. They did exist. We know that when Muchikunda woke up after a long, long nap, he was shocked to see how small everything was. Creatures, people were much bigger. So, and in every major society in the world, the history of giants is there. It's all the mythology talks about it. And some evidences are found. So we know things were different in the past. We know that the information quantity increases as we go up the evolutionary scale. We're much more information than the paramecium or even the trilobite. So how do we fit all this in? That answer I can't tell you, except the missing link is consciousness. But how it all works. How did the universe come about? Let's switch for a second to cosmology. If we look at cosmology, and that's one of the major work groups in the BI, the latest astrophysicists, and we have, I think, 4 astrophysicists, PhDs with us, is that the so-called Big Bang, and the term Big Bang was an invention of a priest, came up with the idea. Curiously enough, he was a Catholic priest. I forgot his name now. So the idea of the Big Bang is that at some point something happened, but what was before the Big Bang? And now the cosmologists are constantly looking at that. There's no way. They just sent up the James Webb telescope, which out into outer space, which can look, you might say, look back in time. Seeing light that was 4 billion years ago, and now it's just reaching the telescope. So, or 10 billion years ago. So they're looking back and trying to, as they say, look back in time, but they can't look at anything before the Big Bang. Of course, if we look at the cover of the first canto, it's all explained. Mahavishnu breathes, the universe has come out and go back in, come back, go back in. So the modern science is now coming up to the conclusion it must be a cyclic universe. Of course, it's the same question, evolution. Where does the information come from? Mm-hmm. So there's a missing link. The problem is, in order to understand these issues, you need to walk on 2 legs, not 1 leg. Now, 1 leg is the material analysis, the science. The other leg is philosophy. And if you cut off one leg and hop, you cannot get very far. You play the kids' games where you must hop only on one leg. You can't get that far. You need two legs. So in order to understand these points, we also need a philosophical analysis. We need to understand epistemology. How do we know what we know? Ontology, what's the source of being? So we need to look at it both philosophically and scientifically and walk on two legs. That's our mission at the Bhaktivedanta Institute here. We'll show you a picture I've showed before, but I'll show it again. We had this conference in 1977, and there I am in the middle, presenting on Sariputta, Sudhamana, Jnana, Madhava. Guess I'm the only one left nowadays. Anyway, at least the only one left in ISKCON. And we're discussing these issues. And we didn't speak, and Prabhupada was very pleased by our presentation, because what we did is, this was a brochure from the conference, and we discussed life comes from life. You can see there information theory, quantum theory, molecular biology. Of course, we made a lot of progress in the last 45 years, but the issues are still the same. And so to answer your question on evolution, sometimes devotees get it wrong. For example, devotees will give, I've heard it say in class, I've never seen a monkey give birth to a human, therefore evolution's wrong. But evolutionary theory never says monkeys give birth to humans. It says there's a common ancestor. And some people I know, it's obvious they're related to monkeys because look how they behave. That's obvious. You can't argue that point very well. But so the question is, where does the information come from to drive changes that go on, and what changes are real and what changes aren't real? And how much in antiquity do humans go? These are some mysterious questions. Obviously, so evolutionary changes occur. We see it in our lifetimes. Wolves to dogs to chihuahuas, certain things occur and certain things don't occur. So it's an area of great insight. There's a series on YouTube. You can Google Atma Paradigm by Akandadi. And it's a series of 30 brilliant lectures. And the evolutionary issue is discussed in there. It's probably the best series of lectures on science and Sankhya I've ever seen. And it's very understandable. So that's another resource for you. So you've asked me a good question, and I've given you a vague answer. Welcome to the world of science.
No, thank you, Brahma Tirtha Prabhu. I'm staying in the movement. You pulled my out of the fire. I'm staying. I'm not going. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Good. Next thing somebody's asked me, did we go to the moon? Okay, so I have a good answer for that one too. Okay, but I think our time is up at 8:09. That's my impression. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure. I hope you all stay safe and healthy in these odd, weird times. Okay. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Andrea, Bhakta Jason Prabhu, Bhima Prabhu, Dion Prabhu, Hari Kirtan Prabhu, beautiful beard, Hari Kirtan Prabhu. You look like a dynasty character.
He does.
Yeah. Kartik, Rohini Dasi, everyone, we love you. Thank you very much. Come again. Tomorrow is another day. Srimad Bhagavatam is every day. Dynasties are almost over. We're getting close to the nectar. Hare Krishna. Brahma Tirtha Prabhu, thank you very much.
Hare Krishna.
Dandavats to all your co-workers with pocket protectors. Murli Gopal, we know.
Yes, Murli's one of our charter pocket protector guys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Hare